Remembering. Okay, excellent. So, and Yogesh is also the chair of the County Environment, Agriculture, and Natural Resources Committee. So, I have some questions. Everyone on this meeting is also very welcome to either ask their questions by unmuting or by putting in chat. It's an informal discussion, but let's start. Mike mentioned that he's part of a group that includes people from across the state. And of course, PFAS contamination, we're going to talk a lot about, the Truax area contamination, Starkweather Creek, a lot of people live near and love. But it's, of course, across the state and across the country and beyond. So, Mike, could you talk about that sort of statewide picture before we zoom in, and how the levels of contamination in Madison soil and water really compare to other contaminated sites in Wisconsin, and maybe some of the activism too. Like, what have you learned from those calls?
Sure. Well, Starkweather Creek is by far the most contaminated surface body of water in Wisconsin. There's a little bit higher levels in some of the drainage ditches around Tycho and Marinette, but they don't even have names. So we know this because the DNR proceeded with sampling of the creek and the fish, and then extended it downstream without waiting for responsible parties to carry out the work, which is actually kind of unusual. They usually want the responsible parties to pay for that sort of thing. And the fish advisory, as it currently stands, extends 25 miles down the Hara all the way to where it empties into the Rock River near Beloit. It's really kind of striking on the map that the DNR has on their site. The primary impact of that is on working class and poor people using fish as a protein source. Most of the news stories you hear talk about suburban or rural areas like the town of Peshtigo near Marinette with Tycho, the town of Campbell by the La Crosse airport. They have really high levels in private wells. The number of people that are affected is relatively small, many dozens, but not thousands. The other way to kill people with a toxin is to expose large numbers of people to levels that are at or maybe just below an inadequate standard, which is what we're dealing with here. Although Wausau is the poster child for that, because every one of their wells is high, has high levels approaching or above the DHS recommended levels. So, there are differences. We have worse surface water contamination that's spread further, but not as intense results because we don't have a lot of private wells. There's one well that I know of 100 yards off of Starkweather Creek that has high levels. But we're fortunate in that sense. The groundwater contamination has mostly gone to well 15. And the levels there are around 5 or so parts per trillion for PFOS and PFOA, which is below the DHS trigger levels. But then DHS got fancy and they threw in a whole bunch of different PFAS into an index, and it's about 15% above that. So that's one of the reasons why they're planning to treat. So that in a thumbnail, that's where we rank. And the activism, a lot of people have been more intense with that than I have. You'll see some of the people from Marinette showing up at state level hearings. I've been to one of those myself, and they're doing a lot of advocacy. Lee Donahue at the town of Campbell is a town supervisor, and she's been very active in trying to help the town to figure out what to do there. So yeah, a lot of the rural areas, it's just a couple of people that are involved, but they're doing a lot of stuff. So that's a thumbnail.
Yeah, thank you. Great setting the stage. And Yogesh. Of course, another form of activism is being a progressive local elected. And so, from your perspective, could you give us a little bit of an overview of, um, maybe what you see as there's been, we'll talk a little bit more about things that have more recently been in the news, but maybe just kind of an overview of what kind of grade you would give the county specifically on what they've done, and what's the thing that you really want them to do next, or are pushing for.
Yeah, so I mean, if we're talking about a grade for the county, sometimes you have a student who starts off by not doing any of their work, and then by lots of encouragement from the community and both carrots and sticks and love, which is compassionate, and love, which is tough. You can get them moving in the right direction. What that future holds for that student is still up in the air, but at least they're moving in the right direction. So just to set the stage a little bit, we know that PFAS chemicals, it's a family of chemicals. It's toxic in parts per trillion. So we can contaminate our entire, Starkweather Creek is already an impaired body of water, but we can contaminate our water supply or our lakes with just, an eyedropper of them, since they're toxic in parts per trillion. And we've seen an increased focus on this in the federal government as well. The federal government has taken some aggressive steps, and the EPA is lowered the amount at which these chemicals are toxic. So when we look at, going from something like 30 parts per trillion and then saying they're toxic in any quantity, we know that if we suffer from any PFAS pollution, that it's permanent because we don't have any remediation techniques. Remediation is being sold as sort of some magic fairy dust which will help us, but we know that right now our best thing that we can do is contain the issue and not get it to spread. And the source of a lot of the PFAS contamination here is the airport. We know that there's been a history of firefighting foams used at the airport, and we know that a lot of the burn pits, which have questionable jurisdictions to them, since they were used by the city of Madison, Dane County, by the federal government as part of their operations with their F-35s. We don't know who the responsible party is there. And you have a lot of jurisdictions who are really afraid to step up and take action there, because that might create a liability. So starting with that, some of the work that we've done is, the first thing is we're trying to get more information to the public, and that's making sure every PFAS test that is conducted is released to the public, is submitted to the DNR, is released to the public, and is made available. Hopefully later on in our panel discussion, I want to show you some of the websites that have been set up for that. Also, in terms of moving in the right direction, through a lot of our advocacy, we had a lot of resolutions that we put forward on this. And whenever you mention the F-35s as part of the resolutions, it sort of hurt their political fortunes. I think people are a little afraid to come out against the F-35s, which has always been a little confusing, because we know that the harms that they cause to our community really outweigh the economic benefits from them. So we have had some success by trying to isolate the issue away from the F-35s and more towards talking about PFAS in and of itself. But with the construction that's happening at the airport to support the F-35s, there is a big possibility of the contamination that we have there that's in different plumes moving. And we know if this gets into our water supply, we don't want to have a situation where we lose all our drinking water, like French Island and La Crosse, or where we have a minor contamination, which has a major public health impact. So that's kind of our focus now. One thing, just to kind of bring the discussion to a little bit more where we are today, we have seen that there's been some promising pilots that have been done for remediation, promising over a 90% reduction in PFAS chemicals in limited tests. I think these results are great, but I always think it's best to prove what those results are. If I'm walking home from a meeting on a Sunday and somebody tells me the Buffalo Bills are dominating their competition. I want to go home. I want to see the score. I want to see what the stats are. I want to see how much time is left in the game before I really believe what somebody has told me. So what I've requested is for the contractor and the county lobbyists to come to our committee, the Environment, Ag, and Natural Resources Committee, and present their data to us. If they have proprietary information, which is their intellectual property, we don't really care how they do it. We want to see what the initial tests were and what the final tests were, and we would prefer those to be peer reviewed by some experts there. So that's kind of where we're at now. I know that's a long introduction, so I'm just going to leave it there, and we can circle back to in more details on some of these points throughout our discussion.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot to dig in. And again, I want to encourage, if other folks have questions, feel free to either share in the chat, or you can unmute or raise your hand, however you want to do it. We're flexible, but I do want to follow up, Yogesh. I am interested and glad to hear that you're asking for the underlying data on that remediation that was announced by press release without any details. And one thing, just seeing that my thought, and I'm curious, Mike, if you have what your reaction was, but my reaction was, well, if you get rid of 96% or 97% of something that's orders of magnitude higher than, above the level at which it harms human health, that really doesn't get you, to where you need to be. So I don't know, Mike, what are your thoughts on the news of the bioremediation? The pilot project. Oh, and you are muted right now. The joys of
Sorry
Zoom.
about that. I'm very skeptical of the whole process, partly from what I saw with their filter. The same company had a filtering system, which I'd like to talk about at some point, but not necessarily right now. There was an article in the State Journal on October 5th by Chris Hibbich, and he interviewed Christy Remicall, professor at UW-Madison, and one other PFAS researcher who's dealing in trying to destroy the compounds. And neither of them was very impressed with the way this is being done. The typical way you do an experiment like this is you take a soil core sample, you take it into the lab, you stick it in a column, and you run water through it, and then you test the heck out of it. You want to find out what was in the soil to start with, and you want to see what's going into the water and then what's being left behind. And there's no indication that any of that was done. Nobody's released any data on benchtop experiments. And there's a lot of stuff going on in this pilot. They've got electrodes that are making oxygen. I saw a description that included use of granular activated carbon, which says to me that what they may be doing is just absorbing the PFAS on the carbon, and the bacteria are doing nothing, which seems most likely from what I've seen in the literature. So really, there's no scientific control on any of the variables here, and you really don't know what's going on. And so there's really good reason to be worried about this, especially since they're planning to extend it to the Dane County burn pits, the retired burn pits. Now those they dumped a bunch of jet fuel and they light it up and then you put it out. It's a training exercise. And when those two things together, the PFAS foam and the jet fuel get together, it forms this gelatinous mass. Jennifer Field of Oregon State has talked about this, and it tends to become very immobile. It's bound to the soil. When you put a bunch of oxygen into a zone like that, you get what Virginia Yingling of the 3M site investigation in Minnesota describes as pulses of carboxylates. Now, what's a carboxylate? PFOA is a carboxylate. PFBA is another carboxylate. And she describes that as a tracer because it's extremely mobile in groundwater. You should see the maps that they have in that investigation report. It went for miles and miles. So my concern, and I think this is intimated by the second PFAS researcher that Chris Hibbich interviewed, is that they're going to take something that's well bound to the soil and immobile and turn it into something that's extremely mobile in the groundwater. And because they don't know what they're doing and there's no controls on it, and they haven't investigated it in the lab before trying it out in the field. And this is worse than the air base, the Wisconsin Air National Guard base. The main source of contamination is nozzle test areas where you just turn the nozzle on, you spray a bunch of foam in the grass, and your test is done. They weren't putting out fires next to the fire station there. So it's a little bit different situation, and I expect the form that the PFAS takes in the burn pits is going to be quite a bit different. And which is why we maybe haven't seen any real data suggesting yet that the burn pits are a big source of the contamination to Starkweather Creek or even the groundwater. Whereas from the air base, there's a huge plume, and they've started to investigate that. So that's my concern. I think you could be making things a lot worse by doing this with no controls and no testing.
Great, thank you. And just to maybe back up a minute, my understanding, and Yogesh or Mike, feel free to add in, but this bioremediation pilot that was announced and pronounced successful by press release recently that Yogesh is working to get more info on, entailed, as Mike said, putting electrodes to make sure that the bacteria that they're saying that are doing this remediation of PFAS in the soil get oxygen to feed the bacteria. So they said they put the bacteria and the electrodes to provide oxygen in the soil, and then tested the PFAS levels of the groundwater beneath the soil. So it yeah, if you have other corrections or additions, please let me know, just to fill in that picture a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the science that we're discussing here, I think is over my head. I think sometimes it's smart in politics and in the community to just admit when there's something that's beyond the scope of your understanding. So part of the reason we want to bring the contractor and the representation from the executive's office into our meeting is so they can explain this in some terms that we can understand. And one of the things that we've done just in terms of oversight is we have a quarterly update that we get, and it's been focused the last 2 years on flooding. And we always get a regular reporting on our lake levels and how many days we're within the range and weather patterns and dam operations. And that's a joint meeting of my committee, Environment, Ag, and Natural Resources, the Land Conservation Committee, which has many members of ENR on it, as well as the Lakes and Watershed Commission. So what we'd like to do is when we get this update, we want that to be part of our quarterly meeting. And then we'll have folks from all of these committees on there. And the contractor is submitting an executive summary right now to the DNR. And my assumption is that the DNR, the folks who are going to be receiving this, are, their background is in science, and they'll be able to ask some of these critical questions. And, I think exactly what Mike and Diane were saying is we don't want to put an untested pilot out there that'll make things worse. Sometimes if you look at how this announcement coincided with the release of the budget, the timing seemed a little, I don't know what word to use, but it was a weird thing to read about in the budget, and it should be done outside the scope of that. So there isn't, so no one has a perception that something's happening politically there. This is a more public health and a scientific issue, and it should be dealt with outside of the budget because it doesn't seem directly related to this. And the $3 million that the airport has, a portion of which will deal with PFAS, not the full amount. That is part of the budget, but I think we would like to have additional oversight over that. And in particular, if this pilot is getting expanded, we want to make sure that we have solid scientific conclusions and there's a consensus behind this approach moving forward.
Excellent, thank you. Um, and so I guess again, if people feel free, if you have questions, if you want to raise your hand or put in chat, however you want to do that. But I will keep asking. So let's talk a little bit more. We've already talked about TRUACS, and of course, it's where the bioremediation was. But Yogesh, you and I think Mike both alluded to part of the complication is that there's multiple like responsible parties here, right? And so, Yogesh, I know your resolution talked about specifically what are the legal options for the county to address contamination around that might get worse because of airport construction if the F-35s do go ahead. So I don't know, can you talk about that and sort of from more of a county focused perspective, how you see the other players in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, and I mean, when we're looking at what legal options we have as a county, we do have the ability to regulate stormwater. And one of the infrastructure projects that's underway right now is to replace some of the stormwater infrastructure that's at the airport where these pipes, the water is leaking out of the pipes and it's going into the groundwater and causing groundwater contamination. We definitely need to fix those pipes, but the other thing that we need to consider as well is if those pipes are constrained and the polluted water is going through them, it's going to Starkweather Creek. It's going somewhere. So through stormwater, we do have some controls there using that mechanism. So, I mean, I guess a little bit of the thinking inside my head, it's you have to sometimes figure out like, is the best approach to be collaborative and antagonistic, and how do you balance those two to keep moving the issue forward? Right now, I would say we're going a little bit more on the collaborative approach, but we are setting some hard boundaries around certain pieces of that puzzle. One is definitely the public information piece of it, definitely around this pilot. And I think the other one that we want to set a boundary around, and Diane, this is what I think you were alluding to, is if we do get tests in certain areas where those levels exceed what is allowed by the EPA or allowed by the DNR, we do want to take some action there, and we do want to have the political will to stop those construction projects. Part of what I think is, first we need to know what those tests are, and we need to have them out in an easily digestible format where the community can get access to them. So that's sort of the first step of where we're at. I've been told that there's extensive testing done as part of all the construction, but my response to that is, well, we want to see when those tests happen and what the results are, and if we see a trend line increasing or something along those lines. So at some point, I'm hoping I can share my screen and show folks a new site that the DNR put out, where they have a little bit more of an interactive map where we can see some of the test results and whatnot. Actually, I'll put it in the chat right now, and then we can.
Yeah, thank you. And it looks like because Martha and I are co-hosting, I might have to grab the co-host from you, Martha, to be able to give it to Yogesh. But in the meantime, Mike, I am curious your thoughts on the different players, the city, the county, and of course the Air National Guard. Like, what grades would you give them, or what are your thoughts to date on where they're at and where they each need a special pushing?
Okay. Well, it's kind of, there's a lot of players. The DNR has been treating the city of Madison, the Dane County as the owner of the airport, and the Air National Guard as responsible parties. So all the letters go to all three. They're all legally responsible. Nobody's got to the point of assigning how much blame goes to each. I think the city of Madison is probably less involved than the other ones because they just trained their own firefighters there, whereas the Air National Guard was doing all the firefighting at the airport, all the training. And Dane County, of course, owns the land, and they had their own burn pits. So that's my impression. On the other hand, the city of Madison has borne the vast majority of the consequences. It's our well 15, where I think they're budgeting $6 million. That's going to come out of everybody's pocket unless the bipartisan infrastructure funding picks up a large chunk of the tab, which is another story. And of course, it's mostly our residents that are exposed to the water. It goes downstream, obviously, but most of Dane County isn't really impacted. And certainly, I don't think the people at the Air National Guard could care less. So there's a huge difference in terms of where the interest should lie here. The city of Madison ought to be much more assertive about what's going on here. And even Dane County, the way that they jumped into bed with the Air National Guard right away, the way they put up a united front, it basically leaves the health of the citizens out in nowhere's land, basically. There's nobody really representing those of us who are potentially impacted by this and who have been impacted by it. Because they're all concerned with their legal liability, and their attorneys are running things. That needs to change. And the city of Madison should be the first one of them that peels off. There should be a lot of talk among the city leadership about how to deal with this mess, especially since the EPA changed the health advisory levels by a factor of 10,000 in June. I mean, that's a nuclear bomb in the regulatory world. You just don't see that. You can plot the health advisory levels going back decades, and on average, once every 5 years or so, it will drop by about 50%. And that's been going on for a long time. This is just a huge change. And the driver for that is work that was done by a Dr. Philippe Grandjean, who's an immunologist based in Denmark and also at Harvard, who is doing work in the Faroe Islands. It's 2/3 of the way out from Denmark to Iceland. Not exactly a PFAS industrial zone by any stretch, and yet he was able to find children unable to take advantage of their childhood vaccinations at levels that were down around 1 part per trillion. And so and why that his work didn't show up in 2016 when they set it at 70 parts per trillion, I don't know. But now it's maybe more data has come in on that issue, but that's what's driving those reductions. And I think it's a really scary thing. We're sitting here in the middle of a pandemic and people are being exposed to levels that are way above what's safe for their immune systems. And so that has a lot of implications, and it really ought to be getting the attention of our local representatives to say that, this isn't just, we're kind of marginally above the regs, it's not a big deal. No, it's huge. It should be considered a really big deal.
Excellent, thank you. And Britton, you have a question?
I do. I really appreciate the conversation so far, and I am just remembering what was said earlier, that it was found at times to be basically there was more political lubrication in a way when conversation doesn't focus so much on the military aspects or the F-35 pieces of this. And yet in response to what was just shared, it's clear that there's just so much that they couldn't care less about this. And I guess part of my experience or perspectives in some of this is that I am a Wisconsin Army National Guard veteran. I'm also a veteran who doesn't particularly like being thanked for my service and things like that. And I know that this is a pattern that replicates itself across the country and across the world, where expansion of US military projects serve as a deflection for environmental struggles and situations and harms all over. And it's the veteran exceptionalism, the US military exceptionalism that creates this challenge in terms of getting any political movement on this. And I guess some of it is, I feel like this can't be sidestepped from the conversation. It has to be named, but also I hear in this conversation too, the challenge that this is a very scientifically complex issue to understand, and how it gets communicated can be confusing too for a lot of folks. It's hard to see how it connects to your own life, how it connects to the pandemic, as we've talked about. And so I do wonder too, for those who are engaged in these local struggles around PFAS, around P35, another intersecting experience I've had in life is working towards an environmental science degree and becoming a certified interpretive guide. And so I know that there are people out there too whose job it is, or people who are skilled at communicating complex scientific concepts to general public in ways that relate to their own lives and what's important to them. And I wonder if that can be part of how we go forward around these issues intentionally within community, and not shying away from these intersections of how the military acts also as a shield politically and within our culture towards facing these very important issues. So I don't know if people could speak on that too, around like who maybe spoke to these things earlier in the conversations, but I'm curious thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. That's there's a lot to dig into there. So I will give Mike and Yogesh if there's anything in Britton's remarks that you would like to speak to, and then I see Michelle's hand up as well. But first, let's respond to Britton's points.
Yeah, I can respond to him briefly. I mean, the thing that was challenging, I brought forth resolutions, and those resolutions had one clause in them. And that clause was that we didn't support the F-35 bed down in Dane County. And with that, what happened was those got basically killed in committee. Like what happened was a committee was in control of something and they postponed it indefinitely, which meant they weren't going to take it up. And the only way to get it out of committee was to do it a complex action through the county board and so on and so forth. By removing references to those F-35s and just leaving it on PFAS, I was able to get it through the committee after it got watered down. The one challenge I think that we have here is the county keeps saying, well, if you look at all the PFAS pollution across the United States, we're in better shape than a lot of other jurisdictions, and we're getting more funding and attention than those other jurisdictions. So there's kind of there's this fear, I think, in some folks in the county, where if we start pushing back against some of the resources that we have to fight the PFAS pollution, which is already existing, will go away. So that's the balancing act that they're running. I don't think it's a particularly convincing argument, but I can also understand why someone would have that perspective. It makes it hard, I think what Britton was talking about when you bring in the military here, and I mean, this is just a little aside, I don't think F-35s are going to be the weapon of choice in future wars. I think technology, drones, and misinformation are probably a lot more likely to be used. And if they were bedding down a bunch of drone ships here, it would probably make more sense. But I'll digress from that. But those dynamics do make it complicated. And I think also, and this has to be said, people have political aspirations. And if they want to play nice with people and move up, they need to sometimes be careful about their thought process involved with that. The good thing is the progressive Dane supervisors, at least, we have no aspirations. Like this is where we're at. we're not going anywhere. We have no life. All we do is political stuff. And yeah, it's great. This is, so we're not doing anything in the future. So we don't really have to care. We're just accountable to the people who vote for us and whatever. And it makes the life a lot simpler. Decision making is a lot simpler. In another life, I was doing that thing. Now I'm not doing that thing anymore. I'm doing this thing, which is a lot more straightforward. So those are just some of the complications.
That's why we love our pro-Dane electeds. And Mike, is there anything that you would like to add?
Sure. Yeah, weapons manufacturers and their lobbyists make a science out of making sure that every congressional district has a piece of the pie. And it makes it really hard to generate any kind of resistance to what they do. And just to give you another example of how insidious this is, and it kind of what Yogesh was saying, it dovetails. At least one DNR staffer said when this before the National Guard Bureau awarded the contract for the main site investigation at the air base, that it was far more likely that you would get that money for the site investigation if the F-35s were coming. And I think that's just that's just an ugly reality. They're not interested in cleaning up their mess. They're interested in maintaining the political will to site their facilities. And I'm a little bit less concerned than some people are about the risk of contamination purely due to the construction that's going on out there, just because I've looked at the footprint of the construction and compared it with where the plumes are, and the overlap is not huge. And if they're testing the soil, and if the soil is staying there and then being disposed of, if it's excess, you're really just moving it a few feet and then putting it back mostly. I'm not as worried about that as I am about the failure to deal with the stormwater issue. And we can talk more about that.
Great, thank you. And Michelle?
Oh my gosh, so many thoughts going through my head right now. This is such a great discussion. So I'm actually in a district that's super close to the airport, and the F-35s are an eventuality of something that is going to be on everybody's radar at some point, whether they like it or not. But as Britton was saying, it struck me, and Yogesh was saying as well, is that we've gone to the higher ups, in terms of like, we went to, I was part of a call with Mark Pocan at one point. Nobody can get Emmy Baldwin to talk about it at all, like, and it just doesn't go anywhere from those ends because of like complexities of how that all operates and all of the kind of give and take of everything. And I totally get that, but we have an opportunity at the local level, sort of, and I do understand that it is complicated, as Yogesh was saying. It has become so problematic, even to bring up F-30. Like, people are so sick of talking about the F-35s, and let me tell you, if you're sick of talking about them, you're going to be really sick of it when they come here. Because you're not going to be able to not talk about it, because the east and north sides are going to be so affected by it. That's all anybody's going to be thinking about half the time. I digress. The higher you go, the harder it is to make changes and to have that accountability. And I feel like there's an opportunity with city and county officials to hold those people accountable to taking a stance on it. And I realize that doesn't always make change. That in and of itself doesn't make change. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is going to act on the behalf of the residents, make those changes, but it does mean something in terms of if we're holding people accountable to say, this is something that's a problem. PFAS is a big issue. This is why. F-35s are a big issue. This is why. those are things that we need to continue to hold people accountable to, and especially because we're going into another cycle of election, of spring election. You know, the whole council is going to be up for re-election, and new council folks in spring. And at a city level, it's just, I think it's really important that we talk to people about this, ask them that question, no matter where they live in the city. Ask them the question about both things, and how, if they understand how they interact with each other, if they even understand it. I had an alder here the other day on my back porch, and the F-35s went, or the F-16s went over, excuse me, and she said, "Oh my God, are those the F-35s? They're so loud." And I said, "No, no, 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 those are 16." And she was like, "Holy shit, that's really, really loud." So I that's different sound, and what we're talking about here are very different, but it's the aspect of, it's the whole city that needs to be thinking about it, and it's the whole county that needs to be thinking about it. And I don't think that you can just, have people that are campaigning and not ask them that question. So I'd encourage everyone here, as people are campaigning or out there trying to get your vote, ask them those questions. Like, we have to hold people accountable to that. And if you don't know, help them find that information and become educated on it. I think this really, we have that role in, as people are coming out for and wanting to serve. So that was a long tangent, sorry, but it's late, sorry y'all.
It's a good point. And I'll just quick add to Michelle's point that in addition to every alder, the mayor is also up for election this spring. So things to think about. Yogesh or Mike, is there anything you'd like to say in response?
Yeah, I think I also want to acknowledge the tremendous work Michelle has been doing, connecting some of these larger issues to local issues like land use and development, and how what's happening at the airport and what's happening with the basing is going to affect what our neighborhoods look like, where people can and cannot live. And is that even, when people are making the economic argument, are these expansions going to do more economic damage than economic benefits? So I think having those conversations with elected officials, particularly, I think sometimes the one critique I sort of have is when people are going after Tammy Baldwin or the higher ups, there's not going to be much traction. But if your alder is, or potential candidate is knocking on your door or asking, that's where you could make a lot of impact. When you're looking at where's your representation at the city and the county level, I think there's a lot of impact that can be made there, because those folks, I don't know, I think we're a little bit more paranoid about like, oh, are we going to keep our seats? Maybe on the city level, even more so. And county level, I think I don't know. But I think there's a little bit more of a concern there. And I think that, you should expect, if you email your alder or your county board supervisor, or you see them at an event, that they should give you those answers, and that they'll have those, they will respond to you, because they sort of have to.
Yeah, thank you. And Mike, any thoughts?
Just very brief. Yeah, local is where you have an opportunity, and that's where a lot of work needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you.
So Diane, can I do a quick screen share and just show some people some info?
Yeah, I believe I successfully made you co-host. So
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen. I don't know if I cleaned up my desktop or whatever, but you'll see what I have here. So there's a couple of sources of information I want to show you. The first one, this is Public Health Madison and Dane County. They have a PFAS website. We're working with them to expand this website, and we instructed them a little bit on a redesign. We want just a very simple link here that says PFAS tests and results that you can click on, that you would get a grid that gave us all that information. So we're working with Madison and Dane County on improving this website. The airport has a website as well. I'll post all these links in the chat. This website it links to what are called the BERTS cases, and that's the Bureau for Remediation and Redevelopment Tracking System. It's a little bit more obscure information. What you'll see is there was a flood of activity from like 6/21 to 12, like through this period of time. This is when the county board was pushing for a resolution for more public information. They were like, you don't need it because we're doing it. But as soon as we got the resolution through, they sort of stopped updating this. So our goal is to make the airport website and the public health website, to consolidate these into one website and provide more of a clearinghouse of easy to access information. So we're working on that right now. But the one thing I did want to show everyone, I put this link in the chat. Here's a DNR website, and it's a PFAS interactive data viewer. So you can scroll over some of these points, and then when you click on these, okay, sorry, I just had to get that working. You can go here and then you can click on these PDFs, and then this PDF will give you the test results for the area. So this is a map of sort of the airport area here, and you can see, you know, we got a 290 here, we got a 3700, we got a 240 and a 32. So if you look at plot number 10 on the map here, this is like, was sampled right here. So this is on the airport property. So this will give you just a little bit of an indication as to where the hot spots are, where we should have some concerns. Some of these, like, you know, the plot number 14 on here, there's not much happening. This is in like the northeast quadrant up here. And so if you look, you can kind of use this data to get a little better idea. And we're going to ask them to expand upon this. This was just released just the other day. So, and then you can zoom out from this and you can see all of Wisconsin. So if you want to take a look at what's happening across the state, you can do that. And in particular, this is going to be helpful for Madison. So I think this is sort of our first step, is to figure out where we're at. And a lot of these are just going to be fish advisories. So if you see something like in the water there, this is basically saying this is a fish PFAS advisory for fish consumption. I would not recommend consuming any fish out of the lakes. In addition to PFAS, there's a whole bunch of other chemicals in there, MG&E related, it's just not. And I know it's hard because I think a lot of people rely on those as a food source, and that's just a really tough situation to be in. So those are just some resources. I'll post the links in the chat there, and then just so everybody has those.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for showing those. And I want to make sure that people also saw Leslie's comment from a little bit ago now about soccer games in the fields next to Starkweather Creek and the urgency, right, of addressing that. So there's there's a lot of things to follow up on. I want to throw out there and get Mike and Yogesh, both of your thoughts on my understanding. We've talked about like the different parties and their responsibility. One thing that stands out to me, in addition to the political hot potato of the military that we were talking about earlier, is that the military seems to be doing the most to stonewall, right, action on this. And I say that because my understanding is that they have started, and I think there was mention of this before, they've started investigations, but that's under a federal Superfund, process. And that can extend, it basically delays, right, action until the investigations are done. And that could be like a decade, right? So Mike, I don't know if you want to jump in, tell me I'm wrong about any of that, or expand.
You're not wrong at all. The question you originally asked was whether the National Guard Bureau is using CERCLA to delay things. And that implies that the National Guard Bureau has any discretion over how their funding works. and they don't. So any federally funded investigation is going to be dealt with through Superfund. And yes, it's a very slow process. The good thing you can say about it is it actually is moving forward. I just saw within the last couple of days, the initial results from last spring have been posted to the DNR website. I haven't had a chance to look at them yet, but they did a lot of sampling in the area in the National Guard base. And so at least they are proceeding with that, and they're spending quite a bit of money. It's probably going to be around $12 million just for the investigation. They've done a big chunk of it already. They've spent a big chunk in the initial stage. It's hard to know exactly what's happening locally. I haven't seen anything effective done yet. They did a preliminary sampling in the burn pits. There's been no effective action with regard to the stormwater yet. We hear they're going to do something with the storm sewers. I'd like to know who is the contractor that they found for that. They initially let it out for bids, and then they said, no, the bids are too high, and they went back. Well, who did they find that bid a lot lower than the initial bids came in? I'd like to know that. I'd like to know what their qualifications are for this particular kind of work. I'm very skeptical based on their track record. It goes back to the filtration system that totally failed because it was done by biologists. It was not engineered, and the results were pitiful. And then I'd like to know, maybe somebody can explain to me, if you're planning on fixing the stormwater, why are you suing the DNR to prevent them from enforcing stormwater regulations? That blows my mind. Why are you spending money on a lawsuit to prevent them from making you do something you're planning to do? It's this whole thing from one end to the other, it looks more like a disinformation project intended to fool the public that doesn't know any better into thinking they're actually trying to do something, when really the only thing that they're trying to do is to avoid spending money to fix the problem. All these things just have no scientific underpinning, and they don't work. Or they potentially do things that are worse than the situation is right now. So I'm go back to the grading question. My grades for Dane County and the 115th would be well below passing. And people need to start. I'm glad to hear that he's talking about bringing people in and having them explain. He also needs to bring in Professor Remicale and people that know how this thing ought to be handled in the first place, and have them talk too. They need experts, and I think he alluded to that. They need experts that don't have a hand in the pie here to weigh in on this, because it just doesn't make any sense to me from a technical standpoint. It doesn't make any sense to the PFAS researchers. It doesn't make any sense to Maria Powell as a PhD in biology. None of us understand what they're trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. And Yogesh, I believe I saw some quotes from you that you were not a fan of that lawsuit either, but.
So there's a couple of things, a couple of good points I wanted to address there. The first is with the CERCLA process. It's kind of one of these things, actually, I think you brought this up, Diane, where we lose a lot of control there, and a lot of the levers that we have are more working cooperatively to try to get that information from the Air National Guard to keep that funding, to keep that moving forward. So I can see how that's a challenging situation. The stormwater permit situation, I think is I just want to share an anecdote about that. We got the news that the county was suing the DNR over these permits, as like, it wasn't in the subject line of the email. It wasn't in the body of the email. It was in an attachment. So it was buried. We had to find it. So I started getting calls like, hey, what do you think about the county suing the DNR over stormwater? I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's like, I don't know. It was like early in the month. I think it was like June or something. It happened. So there's an interesting conversation we had in committee around why there's this disagreement. Some of the DNR testing requirements are a little bit more rigid than some of the testing that they wanted to do. And the claim is it was duplicative and it was forcing methodologies on them that they didn't want to use. My response to all this is first of all, if we have like politically, if we have a Democratic governor, a Democratic led DNR, and we have a Democratic county, I mean, get together and just figure it out. Like this, we shouldn't be suing each other and figuring out in the courts. Get together and figure it out. There isn't an antagonistic political situation there. They should be smart enough to get together and figure it out. So I would encourage everyone to check out that meeting and what we discussed there. Mike brought up an important point about the bids on that stormwater replacement. I gave myself a note to look into that because we were supposed to get some updates on that. So that's something we're certainly going to do and to find out when, because that project was delayed at least a few months. And I thought originally we had no bids on that. I might be confusing that with a dredging project. I know on one of those we got no bids instead of getting any bid. So I let me follow up on that and see what's going on with the stormwater replacement, because that should be underway, or at least it should be awarded. So let me find out what's going on with that. I don't think we've gotten an update on that recently.
All right, excellent, thank you. And I just want to make sure people know we are going to wrap up the discussion around 8. So if you've been pondering a question, now is the time to ask, either in the chat or if you want to raise your hand or just unmute. We're all friends here. But I do want to get both of your takes on the city's plans. We mentioned before to build a treatment facility for well 15, which has been closed since 2019 due to PFAS. Although some might point out that was the previous mayor's decision to close that during another campaign season. So again, I'm curious for both of you, what are your thoughts on, is that a good use of the resources, or yeah, is that a good answer? Do we know that these types of approaches have worked elsewhere sustainably?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, some of these projects where we talk about filtration and PFAS levels reductions, I think there's definitely a public relations aspect to it. And I think also closing that well did have, I mean, out of an abundance of caution, it was done, but there was definitely a political component to that. Since the well was closed and the words PFAS were used, it's going to be really hard to open that up again. Because if you do, people are going to be, they're going to be very unsure about that as a water supply. And I wouldn't be surprised if we test other wells in the city and they have similar levels. So I don't really know what the plan is for the city, but I know that well 15's, it's sure going to be a problem just to build back any confidence into that, and maybe adding some of these filtration systems, which don't really, I don't know. It's hard to do with the scientific makeup of this chemical and how and what low concentrations in it's in, and it's really an emerging contaminant. So I think it makes it hard to do anything that's really gonna to solve the problem. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if well 15 just stayed closed forever.
Yeah, thank you. And Mike, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's going to go forward. They've spent $600,000 on an engineering contract with AECom, which they identified as the top engineering firm in the country dealing with this stuff. The technology is pretty well tested out. They've had a system in Oakfield, Minnesota, by the 3M landfill. Boy, that's been in there well over 10 years. The nice side benefit of a system like that is that it's taking the groundwater and it's pumping it out and it's treating it. It's taking PFAS out of the groundwater. Otherwise, that's going to stay there forever and keep spreading. I don't know what levels they're going to try to treat to. I went to the second meeting in September that they had public meeting at East Madison Community Center. And they're still thrashing through their alternatives for exactly how they want to go about it. They had four designs on the table, and they're finishing up testing the water to see how the different systems work. And then they're applying for bipartisan infrastructure funding that is available from the federal government. And I think they're going to go through with this. And the reason is that well 15 is a huge deal in that part of town. It supplies a lot of water historically, and I think it's really hard for them not to have it. So for a lot of different reasons, availability of the funding, the technology being available, I'd be really surprised if they do not do it myself. Yes, confidence is an issue, but we have other treatment systems and different wells in Madison. They're putting in one on campus for manganese. They do this all the time, and I expect it to work, but depends on how you define works. It's going to bring the levels way down. As far as other wells, they've tested all the wells. We know which wells have PFAS in them. There's a well 16 on the far west side by Memorial High School that has has PFAS levels in it that are somewhat elevated, and they don't know where they're coming from. I'm guessing the Madison Fire Department. Madison Fire Department's been using foam to put out vehicle fires for decades, and they do that about 5 times a year on average, from what I could get out of the fire department's database. They mentioned foam in about 10% of their vehicle fires, which are like 50 a year. So yes, that's going to go somewhere, and some of it gets into the groundwater. It goes down the storm sewers, and the storm sewers are not leak-free. They're not leak-free all over Madison. They're not leak-free in Truax. And the problem at Truax is the groundwater, when the groundwater gets up and it's got high levels of PFAS, it will leak into the storm sewer. And then the rainwater comes along and flushes it out into Starkweather Creek. So they're trying to make those storm sewers leak-free. And that's been done in the brownfields in the Detroit area and the old auto plants where they've had similar problems. It's been used fairly extensively there. I don't have a lot of data on the results, but it's been done before. So that's encouraging, but I need to know, who's doing the work, who's doing the testing to follow up and make sure that it worked. Those are things that I want to know.
Great, thank you. And one quick follow-up question before we do kind of closing remarks here. But do either of you know, so with a filtration system, presumably you have a filter or some area after the water runs through that is concentrated PFAS. And then what happens to that? Is that incinerated or what? How is that dealt with?
I can talk about that.
Yeah, go for it, Mike. I have no idea. That's my answer.
It's a hazardous waste. And there are landfills. There's one in Alabama that's a Class C landfill, and it can go there. There's a lot of money being spent. The DOE, the DOD, and EPA have this agency called SERDP, and they've got all these projects going on. There are people doing all kinds of plasmas and high pressures and temperatures and different chemicals. The researcher, one of the researchers that Chris Hibbich interviewed, found that a particular chemical was helpful in stripping the fluorine away from the carbon. And that's the hard part, is creating is separating the fluorine from the carbon in the PFAS. So there's a lot of work being done, but it's going to take time for that to become a real working thing at scale. So landfill right now is the only alternative because the incineration has not worked. most incinerators that handle hazardous waste don't run at a high enough temperature to break that carbon fluorine bond.
All right. And we are just at the end. Oh, and we have like multiple people joining us just as we're winding up the discussion. So welcome. And yeah, please do, Sue.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I haven't done a lot of reading about it, but I just recently did some reading that those filters have to be changed much more frequently, like every 12 months. And I'm guessing that that's going to add a considerable expense too to keeping that pump running.
They've done those calculations, and they've projected the cost of not just of putting the filtration systems in and possibly modifying, raising the building roof to accommodate them, but also the long-term maintenance cost of running them. So yeah, that's all part and parcel, and the water utility has a lot of figures on that, and that's what they're looking at. They're looking at annual, long-term annual cost of running these things. It's not cheap, but it does work.
All right, great. And we are pretty much at 8, so we're just going to switch to winding up discussion. And I want to give you each a couple minutes for any closing thoughts, and also want to make sure that everyone sees Britton's question in the chat about, do plants take up PFAS in contaminated areas? So if you want to work that in, however you want to work that in, but how about Mike, we'll start with you.
Well, I can address that question. There's a huge problem in Marinette County with the biosolids that have been spread in a lot of different fields from the sewage treatment plant, which was receiving wastewater from the Tyco production facility, not the fire training area, but their actual production facility was dumping its PFAS contaminated water in the municipal sewer system. We've had a little bit of that happen, I'm sure, in Madison as well. So yes, that's a big concern, especially in places like that where it's been deliberately spread. It will show up there.
Excellent. And any closing thoughts, Mike, that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, it's the Chinese curse. May live in interesting times, and this is on a lot of different levels, politically and environmentally. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's hard to maintain focus, especially in the middle of a pandemic, on all the different things. Keep yourself informed. So I appreciate the people who have attended and listened and asked very good questions, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. And Yogesh, I'll give you the last word here.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks everyone for attending. I think I want to highlight a lot of the work that Progressive Dane has done here. Progressive Dane has brought a lot of these issues to the forefront, and not only educated members in the community, but elected officials as well. So Progressive Dane plays a pretty vital role in this, and everyone on the call can pitch in on the policy committee, the steering committee, the elections committee. There's a lot of different ways to get involved, which kind of fit what you're looking at. We do live in a very hard time right now. There's a lot of things that we have to take into account as elected officials and as community leaders. When we look at, we have an election coming up in 2 weeks that could very well, I'm not being hyperbolic here, it could put us into a constitutional crisis if certain actors don't accept the results of the election or work to disrupt the election. We have climate change, we have income inequality, we have a pandemic that we're emerging from, we have public health issues. But one of the things that I think a lot of those problems are solvable, but one of the things that we cannot solve is when we pollute our drinking water. And when we have such a small margin of error to do so, when we're talking parts per trillion, we're in a situation where even though this might not be at the forefront of everyone's sort of thinking, just because it's sort of an abstract issue. PFAS is not something we can smell or taste, or it's not something we can see. It's not, these invisible issues are sometimes some of the tougher ones to deal with. And we found even throughout this call, it's hard to get accurate information on this because a lot of the science on this is emerging and a lot of these problems are emerging. So I think the more we can do to keep this in everyone's mind, and the more we can push at all levels of government, the better it is for us to have the traction to make progress. Because I think with a lot of the pushing that we did, we saw the county sue the PFAS manufacturers. We saw them feature PFAS remediation in the budget. We saw it coming to the forefront. This used to be sort of a problem we never talked about that we hoped would go away. But by talking about it more and by having forums like this, we can have people make it a priority. It's definitely one of my top priorities on the county board, along with many of the other issues that we're dealing with. But I want to really thank Mike and all the members here on the panels too. I think there's a lot of good discussion here, which has given me a lot of ideas for work that we can do as well. So I want to thank everyone. I hope you all have time to have a good dinner tonight, and hopefully you can do some leisure activities you like. I know I'm going to be watching Buffalo Bills game replays on YouTube and trying to figure out how we're going to play the Packers next week. So that's my plan. I am going to hang out with my dog a little bit too. So hopefully you all have some good leisure activities planned as well.
All right, excellent. Well, I think everybody probably joins me in thanking both Yogesh and Mike for a really informative discussion tonight. And thank you all for participating and the great questions and comments. So yeah, and prodane.org, if you ever want to see when a meeting is and come join us, you are always welcome.